Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Derek Van Berkel, and I'm an assistant professor at the School for Environment and Sustainability. And it's my pleasure today to introduce Enrico Di Minin. He's from the University of Helsinki, and he's been so gracious to join us, actually from Helsinki, which is actually 7 hours ahead, so it's a little bit late for him. Enrico really epitomizes the spirit of MIDAS, this MIDAS speaker series, as he fuses both data science approaches to the study of wildlife trafficking and conservation and land use. I think he's really at home in a diverse field, including economics and computer science and sustainability science. I came to know Enrico from his work in big data and social media. And so he was one of the first conservation scientists to use this kind of big data digital platforms to understand the global diversity crisis. He really pioneered with his lab some of the methods that we use in analysis of social media. And I'm happy to announce that he's also going to be able to continue this work. He was recently awarded a European Research Council grant to investigate wildlife trade from digital platforms. So for those who would like to ask questions of Enrico, feel free to use the Q&A. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end to have a further chat with Enrico. So take it away, Enrico.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'll just start sharing my presentation. Derek, if you can confirm that you can see that everything is okay. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to this seminar series. It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. As Derek pointed out, it's 11 p.m. in Helsinki, so it's almost time for me to go to bed. And but I'm really excited to be able to share some of the work that we've done over the last few years on using social media and conservation science. Throughout the presentation for today, you will follow like a temporal trend, which corresponds to how the research in my lab and among my collaborators has changed over time. But I will also take you through some of the great opportunities that we've had of using this great source of data, and also some of the challenges that we faced. And I'm sure for those of you who've been using this source of data, some of you might have faced the same challenges. And I will try to finish with going forward few slides to try and see whether we are still going to be able to use this data in the future and what we could be doing with it. As you're all aware of, we live in a period where humans have transformed ecosystems and are driving a species to extinction, and everywhere in the world. And this is also like a time where people have in many places disconnected with nature, and because of the impact that we're having on the ecosystem, that's also like driving human beings to a green future. I always like to start my presentations by sharing pictures by this great photographer Nick Brand that I warmly invite you to search, to Google search and see his picture. They're amazing. But while we are facing an unprecedented environmental crisis, which is affecting our future on this planet, we're also producing a wealth of information that can be used to help address the crisis and hopefully help reverse it. And as scientists, as a conservation scientist, I started becoming aware of this important source of information back in 2015, when we started working with social media data, and when we published our first paper. Right now I feel like we were some, like pioneers back then, because we were excited about this wealth of data. We were aware of a few possibilities, but of course we didn't know that we would, I would be here today talking to you about a few articles that we've published and how we've advanced understanding this source of information. So we thought originally that we could use social media data to help address 5 main questions in conservation science, which for those who have a background in geography are about where and when information is being posted from, then who is posting this information, what information is being posted, and why people are sharing this information. And if you think about the first slides that I show you today, especially the one on the impact we're having on ecosystems, the reason why we thought that social media data are such an important source of information for investigating the global environmental crisis is because they are a really rich source of information about people-nature interactions. If we want to be addressing the global biodiversity crisis, we have to understand how people are changing environments and try to reverse that. From the work in 2015, in just a few years, we worked on another manuscript that I would like all of you to be reading, especially following this presentation, because it gives a lot of useful information that will help you understand the work better. And this is a paper that we published in 2019 in Biological Conservation. It's a review paper where we looked at what kind of social media data are available out there and which methodologies, which analysis we can be used to analyze this data. In my lab and with my collaborators, we've been looking at social media data to help investigate 2 main topics. One are threats to conservation. Derek pointed out especially the work about the illegal wildlife trade, where we're using social media data in an innovative way to help investigate this trade, and that will be part of this, the second part of this presentation. But we also use the data in the context of understanding opportunities for helping achieve biodiversity conservation. And I know from the meetings that I had in the afternoon already with some of you, or some of the work that Derek is doing, this is also like something that many of you have been doing and which is of interest. The picture on the right, I took it a few years ago in Yellowstone National Park, and I thought it depicted what, in my opinion, was this incredible wealth of data that we can gather. This was a sighting of a black bear family. It was a mother black bear with 2 cubs. And literally people stopped the cars, starting getting off the vehicles and taking pictures, both of the bears and of themselves, and sharing them through their social networks. And I, that's when the light bulb went on, and I thought, okay, if we can tap this source of data, then we can really see how people interact with nature, where they're doing, when they're doing, what they're posting about, and who they are, and why they're doing so. The reason why, again, we thought that this kind of data is so important is because it depicts people-nature interactions, because it's available at very fine spatial temporal scale, although in the later part of my presentation, I will explain you why now in our research, this has become less relevant because of data privacy concerns. It's rich in content, and most importantly, is open for research purposes. Or we know that many social media platforms used to be open for research purposes, and now they're no longer so. So you can already see that I'm giving you some hints about the opportunities and challenges at the same time. So why is this information so important for research? Especially if you think back about those 5 questions that I reported about. Well, if you think about each social media post, it contains information about the users. This is a post from one of my Instagram accounts, so I'm not breaching anyone's privacy. It contains information about where that post came from. In this case, it's Kruger National Park in South Africa. It has information about the likes and the comments that have followed that post. And very importantly for us, it contains information about the images that have been posted. So it's got image content and it's got also text content. And the way we started looking at this data is to look at social media data within national parks. Again, this is a picture that I took in Kruger National Park at an African wild dog sighting. This is the second most threatened carnivore on the African continent. And as you can see, there are many vehicles that have crowded the sighting, and the tourist guides are making space for the tourists to be taking pictures. And I'm sure many of those tourists have shared pictures on social media networks. But we know about that because we now extensively studied this system, this national park. And in the first study that was published in 2016 by my then PhD student, Anna Hausmann, we looked at using social media data for assessing preferences for biodiversity experiences. But from the very beginning, I've been dubious about only using social media data. So we thought of using a way of validating the data that we were collecting. So the question there was, can we use social media data for assessing preferences for biodiversity? And can we actually make sure that this information is reliable? So what Anna did back then, she went over to Kruger National Park, which is of course not a bad place for it to be conducting field work. And she carried out a survey with the tourists, where she asked both about their social media usage, particularly which social media platform they use for sharing experiences when they're visiting the park, but also she surveyed about their preferences for biodiversity, so that we could then cross-check that information with data that we collected from Instagram and Flickr. And when, when comparing the two results, and the question was, is social media a good source of information for assessing preferences for biodiversity? And as I told you, we're also going through a temporal trend of our study. And we are moving from what we did back then, which was at the very beginning, we weren't as sophisticated as we are now, but we did things very properly. So we all went through thousands of pictures of tourists posted on social media, and we manually classified them. Okay, there was like something that looked like these Microsoft Access file on the right, and we were going through the content that had been posted, and we were checking actually which species it was particularly, and then use it for further analysis. And what we found was very interesting. We found that first of all, there was an association between the preferences that the tourists stated in the survey and the postings, the social media postings from Instagram and Flickr. But what we found was even more interesting, that different social media platforms told different stories, whereby Instagram was good at describing first goer's experience to Africa, searching for large body mammals and posting about those species, or posting about landscape pictures, probably to maximize their outreach on social media. Whereas people who are probably more of experts in biodiversity use Flickr, especially to post about arthropods and birds. So the lesson that we learned in this study was, yes, social media is a good source of information for assessing preferences for biodiversity. But remember that if you want to go for large charismatic species, you can use Instagram. If you want to be looking at preferences for less charismatic biodiversity, then you have to be looking at other platforms such as Flickr in this case. Then we continued and we moved from South Africa all the way to Finland. South Africa and Finland have been somehow the two countries where we focus our attention besides global studies. And here we ask similar question: can we use social media data to assess preferences for activities, not biodiversity, but for activities that tourists undertake when visiting a national park? And this study, which was led by another of our PhD students, Woko Heikenheimo, in a national park, which remains in the shape Kruger National Park, very, very randomly. We found, again, by using Instagram data in this case, that, again, social media data could be used as an effective source of information for depicting activities of tourists when visiting a national park. And this was, again, validated, again, survey data that were independently collected from us. Not only, but interesting enough, social media pictures could be used to depict temporal activities in the park very well. For instance, you could see when people were skiing, because from the in the trend, and also kind of like relate that to the presence of snow on the ground, as opposed to people hiking in summer when there was no snow. So from these two first papers, we got the understanding that, at least in the systems where we worked, the data were useful for assessing the preferences and the activities. And then in the next study, we asked another question, which is very relevant in terms of management of national parks. Can social media be used to infer protected area visitation rates? And if so, are some platforms better than others in doing so? And what we found, again, by using our two case study countries, South Africa and Finland, was that, yes, social media data could be used to be in place of the official visitation rate. So this was a study where we compare social media data to official visitor statistics collected by the two national park authorities. We found that, yes, it could be used in place of that data, but we also found that this was particularly so for very popular national parks. So for national parks that are not as popular, this is not the case. And we found that in our case, Instagram was a better source of information, more valid compared to other sources of data. And again, here I would like to stress, like, in all three studies, we use Instagram data, and this was pre-ban on the API, whereby, we cannot collect data from the Instagram API for scientific purposes anymore. And here I just demonstrated to you that this source of information is very important and very valuable for these kind of studies, and we cannot use it anymore. So again, this is a challenge that we are facing. So then, biodiversity preferences, preferences for activities, protected area visitation rates. Then the next study was to look at which variables could be explaining social media usage across protected areas in Africa. And again, was led by, this is a study led by my then PhD student, Anna Hausmann. And we collected data from Instagram and looked at 3 different response variables using social media data. And we tried to look at which variables were most important in explaining them. And what we found, we were particularly interested in assessing whether the big 5, which are these 5 charismatic species that are used continuously for marketing purposes to visit sub-Saharan African national parks, were important in driving this social media use. What we found was slightly different. We found that, of course, there was more social media use in countries where development was higher. We found more usage in more accessible areas. Again, nothing new under the sun here. But we also found that there was more social media usage in areas that were more open. So not in forests, to be clear. And we also found more social media use where there was highest human population and density around the area. Again, this is very often used as a proxy for internet access in many studies. And we also found that there was more usage in areas where the number of species present at the site was lower. And this is again, could be also related to the fact that many sites that host many species are found in more remote areas. We didn't find an effect of richness of charismatic species, namely the big five. And that's again, maybe not completely surprising, considering, in my opinion, considering that the areas where we collected data from were very diverse and were not only areas where the big five were present. As I'm taking you this temporal analysis of our papers, I'm also taking you through different scales of analysis. So from national park to country level, and then continental level. And then, of course, the next one is global. And this is another study where we looked at social media use within important bird areas, which are sites which are internationally being identified for their importance in supporting bird populations and supporting long-term viability of these species. We used data from social media, from Flickr and Twitter, and we also used data that had been independently collected on threats induced by humans at these sites. For the first part of the analysis, we also looked at which variables were most important in explaining social media usage in these sites. And again, we found that there was more usage within areas that were highly accessible, where population density was higher, in areas that were important for congregatory species, so probably where there were like high number of bird species at the same site. We also did something interesting because we used data on points of interest within these protected areas, which was an aspect of novelty in this study. And again, there was more social media usage in areas where the points of interest were higher. We then thought of looking at, as you can see in the map, at the areas where there was both high social media usage, and particularly number of users, and that the site had been classified as potentially threatened by human activity. So the areas on the map that you see in dark red are areas where there's potentially high threat for species conservation. So again, in this study, we also validated our data against an independently collected source of data, and we found sites where potentially we need to be carrying out more monitoring so that the species that are present are not affected by human presence. And as a last example for the work on focusing more on the national parks, I'll bring you back again to South Africa, where we've been looking at the sentiment of visitors to a number of national parks, particularly 4 protected areas. 2 of them have the big five and 2 of them don't have the big five. And I invite you to read the study carefully because it's very interesting. But what we found, we particularly looked at emotions within the text based on a lexicon classification. And what was interesting here is that the emotions were tended to be higher for positive emotions like joy, anticipation, excitement, and that these emotions, positive emotions, were higher in parks that did not have charismatic and potentially dangerous animals. In the study, we also find that overall the sentiment of the visitors was more positive than it was negative. And again, this was particularly so for areas that did not have a charismatic species. Again, probably because people can walk around as opposed to being stuck in their vehicles, because there's the lion that could be eating you if you leave the vehicle. And And again, the fact that we didn't find many of these emotions that tended to be like, more negative. And this is the end of the first part, which focused more on our work on social media, and that benefited from mining data, geotag data within national park boundaries from global to local scale. And of course, we are also interested in using the data for other research questions now. And now in the second part of the presentation, I will take you through what the lab is strongly focusing at the moment, which is about investigating wildlife trade from online platforms. And we are particularly focusing on species that are known to be threatened by the trade. For example, species which are listed in Appendix 1 of CITES, for which a trade is not allowed except in some specific cases. We are particularly interested at those species which are threatened according to the IUCN. And there's really a plethora of species. We are also looking at information retrieved on products derived from these species, such as ivory. And so we have like a broad spectrum of species we are searching information for. An important aspect of this work is that, and it's something that now the lab is focusing a lot on, is about data privacy and data protection. And last year we published this paper that looks at how, informing other conservation scientists, but I would argue that this is also something that is of interest to people doing research on social media and other fields. And it's concerned on providing guidelines on how to address data privacy concerns when using this important source of data. And in the lab, we apply a method whereby based on the research question that we are addressing, we apply first data minimization. So we only collect data that are relevant to be addressing those research questions. So in this slide, for example, the area in black represents the whole source of data that you can gather for each post. This is again one of my posts that we use an example. We often use our posts as examples in the papers. We only collect a number of fields which are relevant for our work, and then after collecting this information, we pseudonymize the data so that there's no option of identification of users or location in our analysis. Our staff are also trained on these measures, and there's a strict protocol for data protection, which is related to the fact that in the European Union, we have a data protection regulation which is very strict and is enforced and is in support of the users, so that there are no such cases as Cambridge Analytica can be repeated. So this is a protocol that we use. Once we've pseudonymized the data, we have the IDs stored in 2 different locations, and all the data and the IDs will be basically destroyed, deleted once the project is over and the data have been analyzed. So this is the first part. We are very strict with this requirement now, and we had to undergo full ethics assessment also for using this source of information, especially to address questions related to illegal activities. A strong component of the work in the lab is related to advancing the use of machine learning methods in conservation science. I reinforce the fact that it's the use of, because of course we're not reinventing the wheel here, because the greatest minds in machine learning are found in different fields in conservation, but we are trying to apply and to fine-tune some of these methods for the purpose of the research question that we are trying to address. And now we'll take you through some of those methods. So in 2019, we published a paper where we presented a framework that could be used for investigation of wildlife trade from online platforms. And as you can see from this figure, this consists of accessing data from the application programming interface. By the way, all the examples that I presented you with until now, these are data collected via the platform's APIs. We need to filter out information because we are searching for specific information on the species, particularly related to seals. And so, for instance, machine learning is needed because if we're just looking for a keyword such as pangolin, we might get a lot of noise represented by a vehicle by the Irish police, a Land Rover vehicle, which is also called pangolin. So we need to apply machine learning to filter out information which is not relevant. Our filtering happens for images, text, visual, and also our audiovisual content. I'll take you through some of the examples just now. One of the biggest challenges that we are facing here is about the training data sets, which is probably for those who are working in machine learning in this audience, it's the same issue that everyone is facing. I'm not actually saying anything new here. And in the context of wildlife trade, this is actually even more challenging because you might be searching for something like rhino horn powder. And so how do you actually train an algorithm to be identifying rhino horn powder, when there's not even images probably available. So there are some challenges, and in a second I'll show you how we're trying to address those challenges. So once we've gone through our filtering, then we have a database that consists of images, text content. Again, I'll show you in a second how we are doing that. And we use that data for a number of analyses, which are related from identifying social networks, to be looking at spatial temporal trends over time, to be looking at the trade in terms of quantities, where the products and the species are coming from and where they're going, et cetera, et cetera. And we're also doing sentiment analysis, so a number of topic modeling, so a number of uses for these data. After the introducing the framework, we also got to do a first-hand demonstration of how useful this could be. And by looking at image content, automatic content analysis, we were able, for instance, to discharge 95% of the content gathered from Twitter as not relevant for identifying content that pertains to rhino wildlife trade. And why is this important? Because you have to be thinking that in some instances, there are personnel who are going through this content manually, and going through 5 pictures as opposed to 500, multiplying these by orders of magnitude more is going to be facilitating the work, for instance, of law enforcers. And that's why these methods are also important and got important real world application. I know that many of you work within this nice network of scientists who are working on applied data science. And I think this is also what in the lab we are very interested that our methods could be used for real world applications. So here we were able to discharge 95% of the images as not relevant, and we stayed with 5% that we used for further analysis. And then I just actually want to put the slides because this is actually what the data could be looking like. This is actually just for one of the analyses that we've done recently for one geographic area. And this is all the information that you might be collecting from a social media platform. So how do you make actually any use of this? How do you filter that information? Well, if some of you have been using machine learning for automated identification of species from images, that's pretty advanced, actually, I would say, in conservation science, especially because of the advancement of the work using camera traps or data from citizen science platforms. But when you're trying to look at wildlife trade content, you're not looking only for the species. You're looking also at something in the picture, for instance, that tells you that that's not a picture of a bird in the wild, but it's a picture of a bird kept in a cage somewhere in the world, and that content might be used for further analysis. So this is actually something that we're working on. I can't show you exactly the figure that we have in the manuscript, which is under review, but I can show you with simple examples how it works. So we are looking at hints in the images that tell us that that is not only a picture of an animal, but indeed that there are people in there, that there's a cage, and or that there is another kind of like, you know, aspect in the picture that tells us that this is not only a picture of something that is found in the wild, like such as in these examples here. And so the algorithms are being trained to identify these specific pictures, and they are working relatively well for mammal species at the moment. So we have like a practical example that works with mammal species. Of course, the algorithms are also being trained for counting items once they're found, because this is very relevant for us to be doing further analysis and probably also cross-matching the information with what happens in the wild and the impact of the species on the wild, etc., etc. But probably the part that we are now very excited about is the part that is related to going through the textual content and using natural language processing in the identification of relevant content. And this is a framework which is related to a paper that we published last year in Methods in Ecology and Evolution, whereby we are using automated data filtering and neural networks to go through textual content of a number of digital platforms. So this is no longer only social media. We're also going through online news. We are going through reports that are available, and we filter out information. We've done it for species which are listed, for all species listed in Appendix 1 of CITES, particularly by using online news as a really nice source of information from which we can extract a number of entities that are useful for our studies. So we're using name and entity recognition to be gathering from the text information about prices, quantities, who the stakeholders involved are, locations, timestamps, etc., etc. So this is also like, you know, something that is going to be very important and in the near future, because of course for many of the products that have been traded online, there is no image content, and so we need to be relying on these methods for going through the text. And you know, you've again for an example of a study that we just finalized on for the Philippines, then we also pick up information from from online news that can be used for a number of purposes. For instance, the conservation authorities in many countries have no information or database whatsoever on confiscation of seizures, even if it's the national authority that makes these confiscations. So these application of using natural language processing, extracting information ad hoc, has been helpful because we've generated a database for the the National Conservation Authority to now go through this confiscation seizure information and look at prices of products over time, so that they can keep a record on what's happening. And again, this is an applied example of how you can use these algorithms for the good of conservation. And just actually, like, you know, as an example on pangolin conservation, pangolin, for those of you who are not aware, is the most trafficked mammal on Earth. They are really threatened. All of them are included in Appendix 1 of CITES. All species are included in Appendix 1 of CITES. And with this method, we can gather information on the location where, say, confiscation has happened. We can get information about the prices paid for a kilogram of pangolin scale, and we can get prices from different countries. and we can see which organizations have been involved in this confiscation. And then we can look also at the quantity. So 130 kilograms corresponding to 287 pounds of pangolins killed, etc., etc. So I think that these methods, and as we're speaking, our data collection framework keeps on collecting data. This is actually very good for compiling a data set that in 1 year time or even shorter we can use for further analysis of the trade. So this work that is focused a lot on the advancement of the methods of their application in conservation science is actually very important for us to collect data that then we'll use for further analysis. And it's a fairly unique data set, as you can imagine. Then from the methods, we go on some of the applications. This is something that one of the PhD students in the group who finished last year has been working on, also on mapping the supply chain of the wildlife trade, particularly for songbirds trade, so for the songbird trade in Indonesia. Again, as I explained in the previous slides, for this study, we use more than just social media data. And we also use, in this case, for instance, data from YouTube, but we also use citizen science data, and we use data from online commercial platforms. And because we wanted to see from the data of the species in the wild all the way to where they were kept in captivity, whether there were some spatial congruence in the location of the data, and whether or whether there was no congruence at all. And we found that there were some interesting geographic patterns. And in the yellow circle, you can see where the species has been recorded. The species have been recorded in the wild. In the central circle, these are locations relating to the trade, so where the species are being sold online. And then in the last one, these are locations related to where they are being owned as pets. So you can see that it's really interesting because, again, the data can be used also in a spatial and geographic environment to be mapping the whole supply chain, and then you can do additional analysis on the correlation between the different places. And what was also interesting, when you look at one of these species, is that you can see where the species is currently being sold. This is a highly threatened species. And as you can see, there was no location from the species as part of its range, because the species is so rare that it's been completely wiped out, and it's probably now mostly found in captivity as part of the trade. And again, as part of this data collection process, we were able to collect prices that we then use for assessing the full range of prices related to the species, which is also very interesting because you can see that there was a difference between our data and, for instance, what some of these owners and sellers have been reported to independently collected data as part of a survey. Again, it's a really useful information, and it's kind of like an additional and interesting source of information that can be used for this analysis. And before I get to the conclusions, I would like to also take you through another sentiment analysis. This time, it's a global sentiment analysis using Twitter data and online news. It focuses on rhinos, which are my favorite species. Everyone who knows me knows that I get excited about rhinos. So we've had a couple of papers focusing on rhinos as part of the social media work too. We collected georeferenced Twitter data between 2011 and 2018 for this paper referring to rhinoceros. Normally, when I'm in an audience with people in the room, I ask what they find strange here, as as the content is related to rhinos, and to some very often to their occurrence in the wild. So this time I'm going to be helping you. Do you think there are many rhinos in the United States and here in Europe? No, of course not. I can see Derek is shaking his head. It's of course people who are very concerned about rhinoceros conservation, probably found in the global north. When I start showing you these maps per country, in terms of number of trees, there are a few anomalies that come up. Of course, the high number in the UK, but also the high number in Antarctica, which is, of course, probably some scientist who was very interested in posting about rhino conservation there. When I also show you the map with the current distribution of all extant rhino species in the wild, you see that it's mostly people outside of rhino range that are talking about rhino conservation. That has got different implications that it will be interesting to be discussing over a drink after this session, but I'm not going to be there present with you, so I'm sorry about that. I'll tell you the story another time. But you know, here we can see that you know, the content has got global extent. It falls outside of rhino range countries, and no surprise, many of the big NGOs are found in North America or Europe, and so that's not surprising. When you look at the distribution of the data in terms of like time zones, you can see again that there's a lot of concentration of these tweets that are coming from Europe and North America, and many of these tweets actually cover around noontime, which we know is when many people are actually tweeting information, when even press releases are going out. And then when we look at what is being posted, there were some interesting results here. So when we look at the count of posts, which is the higher part of this slide, you can see that there are specific events that have triggered reaction in Twitter and online news. One of such news was the passing of the last male northern white rhino that was called Sudan. That had an important reaction both on Twitter and online news. But then what was interesting is that the other events were kind of like, you know, more specific. There was another event which is a posting of a previous extinction of another subspecies of rhinos from West Africa that also caught a lot of attention. And that was also, so we found that extinction of rhinos is a very sensitive topic among public. People are not happy about rhinos going extinct. And arguably, they're not also happy about other charismatic species going extinct. But then when we look at the, and you can see this from the sentiment also, so the lower part of the figure. So when there was an extinction, both events triggered negative sentiment on social media. Then what was interesting is that on online news, on the other hand, the event that triggered a lot of reaction and then positive sentiment was Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, then his fiancée, who visited Botswana, and probably the Royal Press Office was very good at advertising that event, and it caught attention. So what we can see here is that we can track these events which are related to more general wildlife trade, but also more general conservation, by using digital data sources. And also we can look at the sentiment of people and how they react to these events. And this is also informative for decision makers and also the general public. We can put pressure. You know, if you think about other events like climate change events and extinction of species, the public responds negatively, and that's of course something that could be leveraged to achieve some changes in policies. And now I will take you through the last slides of my presentation. So going forward, by all means, this is not something that you should be taking as like, you know, the you know, how research in using social media data should be done in the next years. There's just actually some thoughts on my side for you. First of all, I think we need to be thinking about integrating this information into a framework that looks carefully at identifying adequate research objectives and design. That's the priority. A lot of people think that, well, let's get this data from Twitter and let's do something with it. No, we have to be thinking carefully about the use of the data, because we're seeing that even scientists are being affected by the fact that have not been carefully considering the implications of their research on users. So we live in a world where data privacy is very important, and it's foremost important to be protecting users' rights and privacy, but also it's important to be compliant to the terms of use of the platform. This is also something that I always repeat to my colleagues. So we need to be careful in identifying the right research question and following a strict data ethics assessment. It's interesting because I've been taking you through this like wealth of information. You know, I'm accessing data from the APIs, but we did also something very interesting recently, which was to use customized searches, for instance, by using Google, and in relation to wildlife trade, and we got some very interesting results. You know, that we could be filtering out information very effectively without necessarily going through the whole stream of data from the APIs and identifying content. For instance, we found content related to Facebook here that we are not directly mining because it's not allowed. So again, something to be thinking about for future research. Something that we're going to be doing increasingly in the future is to be combining visual and textual analysis together, and because this is actually very important in situations where the algorithms could be learning from situations where there's more text as opposed to images, and the links between the two. So this is also something that we're going to try to be doing more in the future. And just actually as a final slide, of course, I would just actually want to be reinforcing some aspects. So about the data, yes, we need to be very careful with how we handle the data and how, you know, to be enforcing data privacy and data protection. But who owns the data? It's the users, right? And are the users, would the users agree in sharing this information with scientists? So it's something that we have to be considering carefully about the fact that we might be engaging people directly on the importance of using this data, especially to address global sustainability challenges. We can engage digital platforms more directly. So one of the challenges is not being able to access any more data from, say, Instagram. So can we actually engage this platform more directly? Of course, as a single scientist, it might be challenging, but as a community of scientists interested in using this data for the good of humanity, I think that's something that we could be also exploring further. We need to be developing high quality training data sets, especially in our work. This is important, and you know, the resources are limited, or we need to come up with smarter ways of developing training data sets. I'm sure there's like many more talented scientists listening to this presentation than I am, and I hope I'm going to be able to learn from you how you're doing this in a more effective way. And just actually as a final point, we need to be building multidisciplinary teams of scientists, because these questions which are related to environmental challenges can not only be addressed by conservation scientists separately or by computer scientists only. We need to be joining forces for better addressing these questions. And with this, I am done. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll take a question now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Enrico. Fascinating talk. Wondering how we can best do this. If folks have a question that they would like to ask, then please raise your hand, or if you feel more comfortable, you can just put it in the chat. I have a few questions myself, but we'll give some time for folks to chime in. So one of the questions that I sometimes encounter with social media is that these are huge data sets, of course, but when you actually filter them down and you you get the duplicates. Oh, you kind of filter out the duplicates and the people that are posting a lot. I have trouble with actual spatial representation. So it's actually when we're dealing with billions of points and that sort of thing, but when you actually get down to it, there can be actually a data sparsity over kind of large geographic areas. It seems like you are trying to address kind of global issues. Are there some strategies that you are thinking about to address this challenge, this kind of weird situation where we have these big data sets, but they're actually quite sparse?
Yes, I think it's something that everyone has been facing at some point when using this data, and it's like not only sparseness, but it's taxonomic bias. It's the skewed population, towards younger generation using the platforms and not older generations. So the way we did it, I don't actually have any magical solution, and of course it's related to the research question that one wants to address. But one of the aspects that we've been exploring a lot from the very beginning was to combine different data sources. And of course, different data sources could be different digital platforms, so that, as I explained, Instagram should not be used by itself. You should be combining with Flickr, and if possible, also to Twitter, so that each platform can complements each other. But also, it's about using other independently collected data, which do not necessarily derive from digital platforms, such as survey data that could have been collected in the case of national parks by the conservation authority, or carry out your own surveys for validation purposes. So I think that's important. So always trying to merge different data sources to be correcting for biases or problems. Then, as I say, the research question that you're trying to address is an important one. Also, you can't address any sort of question if the data then doesn't support it. And I think that's also what I was saying earlier when I mentioned that we need to integrate this powerful source of information in the context where we can really use the data to address some important research questions. Otherwise, the research results would be highly biased. Another important limitation that we have at the moment is what I showed in the global online sentiment results, that we have part of the world that is not represented in these analyses, and that to me is also very concerning. And so, if we're trying to address a conservation question which is related to species which are found in Africa, and most of the voices are coming from the global north, and we're trying to get that information as state of the art on the conservation of these species, then there are problems, of course, and we need to be able to address the gap. So, I think combining different data sources, addressing the right research question, using statistical analysis for correcting some of the biases, building a long-term data set might be something that will be important to be addressing that. But by all means, it's certainly a problem which is important to address.
So one of my colleagues, Nathan Fox, he has a question. He says, given that some of the countries that are the biggest markets for illegal wildlife trade do not use social media sites, China has banned most social media sites. Have you looked into using country-specific sites such as Weibo?
Yes, it's a very good question, and yes, the answer is yes, we have. I'm not sure we've been very successful though, because it's the process of acquiring data is more laborious, and it requires very often a local and national collaboration to smoothing the process. I have been in meetings with some of these platforms, and where they've been listening to presentations and some of the work that we've done, and we are collaborating with some of these platforms. So my answer is, at the moment, we haven't published anything by using this data, but it's definitely a source of data that we tapped in, and then we're going to try to get more information on in the future. If I can build on the answer, the other level of complication there might be the language, because of course, if most of the algorithms that we're using for natural language processing, they're built on for English, and so they're not as relevant as you can imagine for other languages. So we are also trying to see how we can use some of the algorithms which have been used or developed for other languages for instance, Chinese platforms. Russia is also like another market, you know, and where they're using different social media platforms. So by all means, and building on the question that Derek just asked, that could be another bias, that, you know, we cannot cover all of the social media platforms that are relevant in each country. And the other answer is that it's not only big social media platforms where wildlife trade happens in China, for instance. It happens on apps, antiques, you know, with apps where people are selling antiques, and they are selling rhino horn, for instance, in as part of these platforms. So we are also not able to tap into some of these apps because there's no option to get the data. And that's where, to some extent, it's still important that the law enforcers are there monitoring these platforms manually.
Indeed. I think we can probably let you go. One of the last things that I would kind of mention is, I think that you bring up this idea that we have to somehow have alliances with some of these platforms. We have to you know, talk to them and see if we can get broader data access from some of these platforms, but also be mindful of their own kind of curation of the data and that sort of thing. And yeah, hopefully they can see it as a public good, and you know, not so much as an adversarial role, which kind of seems to be happening right now, where there's some sort of controversy about you know, on social media and, you know, selling your data and that sort of thing, but that it could actually be used for good.
Yes, by all means, I think it's important that is done. I think there's also, like, you know, a safe way of potentially building on this collaboration, which would be that researchers are running analysis within the safe environments of the platform, so that, you know, they don't necessarily need to get the data out of the platform. The data can be analyzed without taking a single bit of data out of their safe environments. I agree with you. It's data that are being generated by users. Another way would be to be asking users to be making their data openly available as part of the use of these platforms. So, but by all means, actually, we need to do something, because we've been losing many opportunities over the last years of tapping in on really good, you know, sources of information that can be used for a number of really interesting analyses, always respecting data privacy and by using machine learning in a responsible way, so that it doesn't affect actually anyone, and it's just for the good of society overall.
And with that note, I think that's a good note to end. We thank you so much for spending this hour with us, Enrico, and wish you a good night's sleep. I really appreciate all the folks that could come and join us for this discussion. Yeah, obviously we can't clap, but I'm virtually clapping. Thank you so much, Enrico.
Thank you very much, everyone. And it's a pity that I cannot be there live. It would be nice to be continuing the discussion, but as I mentioned, please reach out to me if you have already had some really interesting meetings in the afternoon, and please reach out to me, and you know, via email, and we can organize for other online meetings. And thank you very much for this opportunity, and good night to everyone on my side.